cannibalism, witches, reincarnation, blood, and death. It sounds like another King masterpiece, but it's not. This is the real meaning of the tale of Little Red Riding Hood. Today, we'll remove the pink veil of censorship and childish simplifications from this fairy tale, leaving the primal, beastly, and dangerous side it really has. So remove the children and sensitive adults from the screens, and let's go to the dark side of the tale. Red Riding Hood turns out not to be such a young girl, if you learn that the approximate age of the European version of the tale is about 600 to 800 years. In general, the world gave us about 70 variants of the plot of this fairy tale. For example, in northern Italy, a girl had fresh fish in a basket. In Switzerland, cheese, and in some regions, a boy carried pies instead of a girl. We'll not travel the world with you, but we'll focus on the versions of the Grimm brothers and Charles Perrault to get to the truth and understand how it could really be. So, there lived a little girl, so cute that everyone who met her liked her. Moreover, according to Charles Perrault, it was the most beautiful creature anyone had ever seen. Remember that detail, okay? Most of all, she was loved by her grandmother, who once gave her granddaughter a hood made of delicate red velvet. The gift is quite expected since in many cultures, a girl who has reached a certain age has to hide her hair as a sign of maturity and the need to preserve her virginity until marriage. It was also believed that women's hair is a powerful means of attracting men's attention and contains a power that should be hidden from prying eyes. Interestingly, only wealthy people could afford velvet. Like silk, it was an indicator of high status. King Richard II of England, for example, wanted his body to be buried in Italian velvet. So, where did the village grandmother get such a royal treasure? If you are patient, you'll get an answer to this question very soon. The fairy tale says that our girl really liked the grandmother's special gift, a red flaming riding hood. Soon she was called Red Riding Hood. We will call her Red for simplicity. But it's unlikely that the villagers were delighted with the young girl walking around the streets in this outfit. In Puritan Europe in ancient times, red was considered the color of debauchery, female temptation, and hell itself. A decent woman could not afford to wear a red hood, as this color was considered sinful. What are these strange hints, eh, grandmother? Don't worry, there's an explanation for all of this. The fact is that Red is not a simple country girl, but the illegitimate child of a nobleman from the neighboring lands. That is why her father does not appear in all the versions of this tale that we know of. Follow the thought. We know for sure that hunting was one of the most favorable pastimes of the nobility. Rich landowners, lords, and others could leave their homes for several days or even weeks in search of picturesque meadows and game. Red's father could wander into that region in search of deer and wild boar, and after satisfying his desire to kill, he came across a village woman with whom he decided to quench another thirst. The peasant woman may not have wanted to give herself to a stranger, but he wasn't interested in her opinion. Of course, when Red's mother appeared on his house doorstep with a newborn baby 9 months later, the man was not happy. Rarely in those days were nobles ready to recognize bastards as their legitimate children, but Red was still a little lucky, because the nobleman, in order to prevent the woman from spreading rumors about his lewd activities in a God-fearing medieval society, bought her silence with some expensive things, among which might be red velvet as well. But not every mother is burning with a desire to raise a bastard, so our woman could leave an unwanted child at the door of her relatives, for example, a brother, along a part of the dowry, and run away from the world in her shame. Red's uncle, like most peasants of the time, most likely already had many children, so it's not surprising that his wife was not happy about the extra kid in the family. Nevertheless, she had to raise the girl as her own, under the judgmental eyes of her neighbors. Even if Red's real mother didn't want an extramarital affair, we have to consider that in those days it was usually the woman who was blamed, not her abuser. Also, it's quite likely that the grandmother believed that her daughter had provoked the man. Despite her love for her granddaughter, the old woman saw in her a reflection of her daughter's adultery. This is where the red hood comes from. It's an inheritance from the father and at the same time, a manifestation of the grandmother's passive aggression. Once the stepmother informed Red that the grandmother was ill and that a basket of food should be taken to her house in the forest. We'll talk about the peculiar residential preferences of the grandmother a little later, but now here's another question. What person in their right mind would send a child into a dark forest alone? Even if the mother was not a relative and did not really love the girl, she could not deny the fact that Red was useful in the household. As was customary in many rural families, Red had to babysit her younger siblings, working off every morsel of food. Also, this healthy girl, judging by our previous facts about the hood, had just entered childbearing age. There was no point in risking her life like that. Medieval families consisted of a dozen children, so it was possible to send at least a few more with her, preferably brothers. And how did the woman even know that her grandmother was sick? FaceTime had not been invented then, most likely some forester or hunter who passed by the grandmother's hut on the way to the village, where he was going to replenish food supplies or sell game, told about it, so why not treat him to a bottle of wine and ask him to take food to the grandmother? Of course, a woman could do this if she wanted to save Red's life. Instead, her grandmother's illness gave her a great chance, never to see the girl who annoyed her so much ever again. The shame caused by an extramarital affair left an unpleasant imprint on the family's life, and every year, due to the lack of contraception, the number of children in the family grew, and it became more and more difficult to feed them. But the main reason for such a strong hatred for the stepdaughter is much more banal: envy and jealousy. Do you remember that Red was very pretty? And it's not just like that. In the Middle Ages, most cities and villages were much smaller than ours, and the community, accordingly, was more closed. Everyone knew each other and rarely traveled, again because of the danger and bad roads. In small villages surrounded by dormant forests, many of the villagers looked downright ugly due to generations and generations of incestuous marriages. But our Red, on the contrary, was like a delicate rose in the middle of a fire-burnt wasteland thanks to a foreign father. When she was little, her stepmother used Red as a mercenary, but when the girl grew up and quickly overshadowed everyone around with her beauty, the woman began to notice how her husband looked at Red. The stepmother's patience burst. Of course, she didn't want to get her hands dirty and get rid of the girl herself, but there was no need for that. The forests are full of dangers even now, and then the chances of getting out of them alive were generally slim. Wild animals, robbers, lack of maps and navigators, all this gave the woman confidence that Red would not return alive from that forest, and if she came back, she could send her back again. By the way, about the house in the forest, it's a very strange choice to live, isn't it? Unless you're a witch, of course. Previously, in the forests, far from the human eye, lived healers who were attributed with connection with otherworldly powers due to their alleged supernatural knowledge. Our grandmother, although a little wary, was respected. In times when medicine was not at the best level and doctors could only be found in big cities, the church was responsible for the health of the peasants. We can assume that it was of little use. Likewise, women like our grandmother saved people with their healing herbs, performed abortions, and took delivery of all women in the village. This explains why, in different versions of the fairy tale, the girl did not bring healing tincture, herbs, or honey to her sick grandmother, but always food. After all, the grandmother could take care of the cure, even without outside help. So Red entered the shade of thick ancient trees, thereby repeating hundreds if not thousands of fairy tale and mythological stories about a hero who is driven by external circumstances to enter a dangerous path full of obstacles. Here it's worth mentioning Joseph Campbell and his popular science work, The Hero with a Thousand Faces. It describes in detail the theory which says that all mythological and fairy tale plots known to us have a similar construction formula. Campbell called it the path of the hero. We'll not analyze it completely. Now we're interested in one of the points of his path, guardian of the threshold. Leaving his old life behind, the hero stumbles upon a creature that guards the entrance to another world where higher forces rule. Behind such a guard is darkness, obscurity, and danger, like the one to which a child without parental care is exposed. In our case, we can consider that the wolf is the guardian of the threshold, past which Red must pass in order to complete the initiation of adulthood, and the woman who played the role of a mother figure in her life sends her to be tested. Like many young people of remote tribes who have to leave their community for a certain time and survive to prove their maturity, the girl from our fairy tale goes to the forest to her witch grandmother in order to survive and return despite everything. In different versions, the mother says to the girl, "Follow the path," or "Don't talk to strangers." But when Red meets a wolf in the forest, she slightly agrees to a dialogue and then, even at the persuasion of the wolf, turns off the road to gather some flowers for the old woman. Meanwhile, the wolf himself runs to the house. Why did Red still decide to talk to a stranger despite the prohibition? There are two versions here, quite interesting ones. The first is reverse psychology. The girl is obviously about to enter or has already entered adolescence. It's a period when you're trying your best to prove your maturity to those around you. The stronger the prohibitions, the more the child wants to bypass them. This is what our Red did, ignoring her stepmother's words. But there is another version. What if I say that Little Red Riding Hood knew her attacker and quite well? Therefore, technically, she did not violate the order. From the 15th to the middle of the 17th century, a terrible storm called the Witch Hunt passed through Europe. In addition to the burning of heretics, trials of werewolves were also spread, held mainly in German French-speaking countries. For example, in 1521, in the French city of Besançon, several villagers were tried as werewolves at once. Under torture, they confessed to making deals with the devil, who gave them a magical ointment to turn them into wolves. Germany still remembers the case of Peter Stump, who lived and committed crimes in the town of Bedburg. It all started with the fact that livestock began to disappear from the pastures. Then it was even worse. Women and children began to disappear, whose torn bodies were found by the towners. One day, a local saw human tracks near the victim, so everyone came to the conclusion that it was a werewolf. He killed about 14 children, several women, including pregnant women, until he was caught in hot pursuit. It was said that when the hounds surrounded the werewolf, he threw off his magical belt and appeared before everyone in human form. What was the surprise of the hunters when it turned out that the murderer was the well-known virtuous farmer, Peter Stump, the unchanging headman of the parish, the favorite of all the beggars near the church. He always gave alms generously. Of course, we'll not claim that the convict, like his predecessors, was a real werewolf. Under the torture of the inquisitors, Peter said that he entered into a deal with the devil who gave him a magic belt. But let's be honest. Anyone could confess to anything, having been in the red-hot iron boots or taking part in other inquisitorial attractions. Such crimes have a completely logical explanation. All these pseudo-werewolves were serial killers. Probably there were enough of such people in Europe long before the appearance of the Inquisition, but it was this organization that became the first more or less serious judicial structure in the Middle Ages, and it was the Inquisition that first faced the need to do something about strange, overly brutal murders. And the version about werewolves and demonic intervention was very easy to believe given how inhumane the mutilation of the victims were. All those court cases were very high profile and could have reached the people of other countries with significant changes in the plot, as is usually the case in word-of-mouth radio. To understand how strongly the legends about werewolves influenced the minds of people of those times, let's recall the novel The Legend of Til Urenspiegel and Lama Godzak by Charles de Coster, which vividly describes the social processes of the medieval Netherlands. The writer had access to archival Flemish chronicles and studied the folklore of Northern Europe for a long time, so we can be sure that the book faithfully portrays the image of the era. At some point, a werewolf appears in the plot, a wolf that brutally killed people in the suburbs. The main character managed to trap him. It turned out that the thief was not a mythical creature and not a dark magician, but an ordinary man who used a waffle iron with sharp teeth on the sides to bite off the victims' necks. It's likely that the writer borrowed this image from creepy folktales about real serial killers. And here, ladies and gentlemen, we return to our Red, who meets not a wolf, but a serial killer in the woods. A madman who in ordinary life could seem like an absolutely ordinary peasant. And our Red, accordingly, could know him very well as her neighbor, the person who smiled at her at the fair, or the one who sat next to her at the Sunday service in church. And it's no longer so scary to tell him about where the grandmother lives. And the suggestion to linger and pick flowers on the lawn does not sound so suspicious. This correlates very well with the mother's admonition to follow the path. It would seem that the woman, on the contrary, was more profitable if the stepdaughter got lost. But her plan was different. She wanted Red to come to the appointed place because the killer was already waiting for her there. The stepmother was either in cahoots with him or simply knew that something evil was roaming the forest and that this evil would most likely be waiting for new prey somewhere on the road. But Stump lived in the 16th century and there's references to the Little Red Riding Hood since the 14th, you say. Well, first of all, folklore is a changeable thing. It never remains in a stable form over time. It grows with new details and rejects what is outdated. We cannot describe with certainty the evolution of the story of Little Red Riding Hood, but we can say with certainty that at the time of writing the fairy tale by Charles Perrault and the Grimm brothers, and this was in 1697 and 1812 respectively, the trials of perverts had already taken place. If we still talk about the period before these events, then wolves, even without legends about werewolves, posed a great danger to others. In Christianity, the wolf was a symbol of evil, the devil, the destroyer of the flock, cruelty, cunning, and lies. And Red, as we remember, must pass the test and defeat the sentinel of the threshold, thereby overcoming lies and sinful temptation, the embodiment of which is the wolf. It can be said that the first round of the battle with evil ended in a loss for Red because the werewolf in human form deceived her. While the naive girl was picking flowers, the thief ran to the old woman's house and pretended to be her granddaughter to get inside. He could kill the girl at the first meeting, but how can you turn down the opportunity to put on a show and enjoy the bonus in the form of an old woman? Next, the werewolf eats the grandmother, metaphorically or maybe in reality, because no one has abolished cannibalism. After that, he changes into women's night's clothes and goes to bed. Don't forget he's a maniac and he wants to put on a show. Little Red Riding Hood finally reaches the little house, and this is where the stories of Charles Perrault and the brothers Grimm diverge. The brothers immediately have a famous dialogue about big teeth, ears, and eyes, after which the wolf swallows the poor girl. But for Charles Perrault, from this moment on, the fairy tale finally becomes creepy. The wolf invites Red to undress and lie down in bed with him. Only at this moment, there's a conversation about body parts. Why does the girl not have a logical question? Why does the grandmother ask to sleep with her? After all, she's sick. How is this supposed to help her? Well, here everything's a little simpler. It's unlikely that the grandmother had several places where you could sleep. Therefore, Red had no choice but to lay down in the same bed. It was too late to go home. She might not make it back before dark. The question is different. The girl had to be a complete idiot if it took so long for her to realize that it's not her grandmother in bed. But no, she actually sensed danger as soon as she got into bed and decided to bide her time with this strange dialogue to figure out how to get out of here. Unfortunately, the werewolf managed to grab her in a tight hug, and the conversation did not lead to anything. Before Red Riding Hood was swallowed, something you probably thought of could have happened in bed. In Charles Perrault's version, this is where the tale ends, but the Grimm brothers decided differently. A hunter walking past the house heard snoring, saw a wolf in bed, and figured everything out. He opened the wolf's stomach, and the grandmother and granddaughter came out. They filled the wolf's belly with stones. When he woke up and tried to run away, his body was too heavy, and he died. This is a jack-of-all-trades hunter. That's how much you need to be a good surgeon so that the seams are invisible. The image of the wolf that swallowed Red and the grandmother alive also exists for a reason. On the one hand, this is a hint of the wolf's desire to transform into a woman, at least a little. A woman's dress, a living creature in the belly. Obviously, he would like to change sex, but he did it in a very disgusting way. On the other hand, the motif of getting into the stomach is not new. While researching stories from around the world for his hero's journey, Campbell noticed a trend. Sometimes the hero doesn't overcome the sentinel threshold. Instead, he gets swallowed up. This stage is called whale belly, and it's found in many peoples. For example, the myth of Cronus swallowed all of his children except Zeus, or the story of the African Zulus about a mother with 2 children who were swallowed by an elephant. At this moment, the hero enters the unknown, and upon returning from there, he seems to be reborn, becoming a better version of himself. The same thing happened to Red. She ends up in the wolf's belly and returned to start a new stage of her adult life. And this connection with other stories from completely different parts of the world once again proves that we've witnessed not just an instructive story about the dangers of communicating with strangers. This fairy tale has its roots in the most ancient times where different rules prevailed, where each thing had its own symbolism, and social fears were woven into the plots of fairy tales so that everyone from a small child at a subconscious level knew what to be aware of. This fairy tale is not only a vivid reflection of the era, but also the result of the evolution of our society. Unraveling it layer by layer, like counting the rings on a cut tree, we learn more about who we are. And the best thing about all of this is that it's still alive and changing right now before our eyes. As you can already understand, there are still many tales like this with a double meaning. To learn more about the true meaning of the stories you know, subscribe and click on the bell, and that's all for now. See you on the dark side of stories.